Now, I actually can still call myself new, I think, to the energy industry, having not started until last September in what has been, what is a very exciting time, certainly for the energy industry. And the organisation Energy UK is in itself recent in the sense that it has been put together from some existing organisations, the energy retailers, the UK Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and the Association of Electricity Producers. So right across the piece are our members from different types of generation, different sizes of companies, different types of suppliers, and underneath our membership lies the provision of energy to something like 94% of the British public. And where I came from was, of course, the banking industry, another, if I may say, very well-loved British industry. Very good for the country in one respect, but I think the word loathed is probably about right, sadly. And perhaps I could do one other confession, and that is for a number of years I was a non-executive director on one of our water companies. So in essence, whilst banking, of course, is not a utility, nevertheless it is in many people's eyes. Water is certainly a utility, energy is certainly a utility, and what they all have in common is a large number of customers, a very big and broad base of retail, and an assumption from the customer that they have a right for the service. So I wondered if I could perhaps sort of share a few of my thoughts. And perhaps the one that I would start off with will have to be the banking industry, where I was for 5 years, from April the 1st, 2007, never start a job on April Fool's Day, and was there for 5 years of probably the most turbulent years of the banking industry in the last 200. The perception of that industry is that it's too big, that it's too overpaid, that it takes huge risks, that it doesn't understand what it's doing, and that it is a disbenefit to the UK economy. The reality is the majority of that industry just is ordinary people like everybody else. Some million people work in that industry, predominantly on the retail side. Got a large amount of committed staff. They're actually trying to do their business well for their, 60, 70 million customers. And when you have got that number of customers, you simply cannot get it right 100% of the time. If you get it right, say, 99% of the time, that means you get it wrong 1%. 1% of 60 million is a huge number of people. And it is actually that which is probably one of the most fundamentally difficult things for any of these organizations. It's just that large number of customers and the inability to get it right all the time. So one of the things that one has to judge them by is not whether they make mistakes, but it's how they deal with those mistakes. You know, it's how they deal with complaints, which I think was one of the things that Joe was saying. And perhaps I could just say to you, my experience of ASOS is a bad one. Because when I ordered it online, it looked lovely. And when it arrived, it didn't fit. So as far as I'm concerned, although I had to, could send it back, I wanted it to look on me like it looked on the picture. And it didn't. And of course, that's not my fault, is it? But if I think about some of these in the context of the banking industry and the impossibility of getting it right, I think about then perhaps two of the great examples of how the industry got it wrong. The first was by offering everybody free, if in credit, banking. There is no such thing as free. You cannot somehow magically do banking with apparently no systems, no people, no branches, no head office. You can't do it. There is no such thing as free. And if you tell people something is free, they don't value it anyway. So really, possibly one of the main mistakes of the banking industry was the model over the last 20 years was built on free, if in credit, banking. some of the reason they could do it was because the inertia of us as individuals to move from one bank to the other, we're surprisingly inert. There used to be a statistic, which was true up to about 2 years ago, that people got divorced more frequently than they changed from one bank to the other. So, of course, that inertia meant people stayed. That inertia meant, therefore, that, you know, you as the bank had got their money. People tended to leave their money more in their current account than they should. Interest rates were high, so that was how it got paid for. But in a low-interest world, and one in which people do take more control of their money, and they do, free banking if in credit, no longer is anything other than a loss-making business. So what do you do as a bank if you've got a loss-making business? What do you do if you're any company if you've got a loss-making business? You scratch your head and you say, I'm going to deal with this in a couple of ways. The first is you cut costs, and the second is you broaden out the services. So broadening out the services means you've got to sell people something. You've got to sell that inert customer base something which you can make money on, and cost-cutting you draw back into big call centers rather than staff up the branches. Actually, probably some of that would have happened anyway, as people moved from wanting to go into branches to wanting to do things 24 hours a day, telephone, internet. So you've got to service people down the multiple channels that they want to be serviced. But that combination of the cost pressures and the combination of the low interest rates and the not being able to make money out of your normal banking practice, your basic raw material, your basic service you couldn't make money out of, meant that the banking industry got more and more distant from its customer, more and more distant from what it was that their customer really needed, and they had to sell them things. And what was the second? I think the second great mistake is they missed the social media change. They missed the way in which you can build up now very, very quickly a huge body of complaints in a way that didn't happen before. And I would take as the example for this one was the bank charges. That is, you know, when you went overdrawn without notifying people, your bank first, you got hit with a charge which then steadily increased. And yes, there were complaints coming through the door. Yes, there were, of course, telephone calls. And yes, there were letters. It was considered, though, not unfair, not unreasonable, and the complaints weren't huge, until the point that that bank charge went to nearly £30. And suddenly the complaints increased. But why the banking industry missed it was they missed what was happening in the social media. And so it went from some complaints coming in through the door, some complaints coming through the telephone, to a huge number of complaints. Over a period of something like 8 weeks, suddenly there were 1 million complaints. And that is the power of social media. And that was missed by the industry. And dare I say it, lots of other people missed the social media. Why? Because the people who run things are old, with all due respect. You know, we're not, I imagine that there's somebody in this audience tweeting. There might be several of you tweeting. Interestingly, most of us don't tweet, you know. I mean, I have a Facebook page, but only because my sons did it. I can't work it. You know, who runs the companies? It's not those who are in at the bottom, you know, with the latest gadget, understanding how to tweet and blog and all the rest of it. And that's why developments get missed. And so that was, if you like, the second real problem of the banking industry. And you will think of others on the back, but I think, if I may say, those are the two fundamental issues. You can't do something free, so don't pretend you can. And the second is the way in which the world works changes, and these days can change quite dramatically. And you go from what you understood to be a norm to something totally different. If you miss it, your problems got very big. And as soon as your problems got very big, your solution is that much more difficult. And in bank charges, the solution ultimately ended up in the courts, in the highest courts of the country. That is not a place to go. So with the energy industry, where are we there? Well, the energy industry, of course, is still viewed in the eyes of many as not just being a utility, but also being something that actually should be state-owned. I appreciate that it was privatized in the 1980s, but do not underestimate the fact that privatizations of some of these core services it's still considered to be somewhat divisive. And as far as we're concerned in the UK, we still tend to be something of a leader in believing in open, competitive, and liberalized markets. So there is, in energy industry, as in some of the other utilities, still a not inconsiderable view in the country that it should be state-owned and it should not actually be privatized. That, if you like, starts as a problem. It may not be a base problem, but it is an issue. And it's an issue that comes back and back to the fore under certain circumstances, and those circumstances are price. Because again, if we look at some of the social issues surrounding energy, it is considered to be not only a basic requirement, but in some instances, a basic right. After all, the phraseology fuel poverty, implies that. There is a welfare element that sits around it. The industry itself is actually engaged in some instances in doing what one would otherwise consider to be the responsibility of the state in respect of welfare, basically discounts for certain families and elderly people on certain benefits, and secondly, through the insulating program, again, particularly for difficult families. So there you have two areas which are normally would be considered to be coming out of the welfare budget of the country, is actually coming out of the energy industry, an obligation placed on them. So this is a difficult line in which we tread. On the one hand, it is the provision and delivery of an essential part of our lives. Secondly, you are an independent company. You've got shareholders to be responsible for. Thirdly, you are engaged in doing some of the responsibilities of government's welfare budget. It's done on the energy companies and therefore socialized across their entire customer base. It is not straightforward. A second major problem for the industry, and one which we're absolutely hitting right now, is the whole question of the energy bill. Now, I'm not going to ask people to do hands up or call. Oh, well, maybe I will. Maybe I will. How much of a standard energy bill is energy? So you've got, you're a household, you're householders. Most of you, I suspect, will have a dual fuel bill. That is, you'll buy your electricity and your gas off the same company. What percentage of your bill is energy? That's right. That's right. You're not in the industry, are you, sir? Yeah. Well, that's cheating. That's absolutely cheating. He knew the answer. The answer is about 50% of your bill. Only 50% of your bill is energy. Yeah, of course, there's some of the costs in there. The operational costs of the company is about 12 to 15%. They do make a profit. Profit is actually a hooray word, not a boo word, despite what one might think. The profit, as a percentage terms, is relatively low. It's 5 or 6% only. And the rest of that bill are charges which are not related to the energy company. It's paying for upgrades of the grid, of the distribution network, not owned, by the way, by the energy companies. It's paying for some of the green levies. It's paying, you're paying for some of the social levies. They all come through that bill. And on the energy side, the energy cost, we are, of course, a country which uses a lot of gas. That gas is predominantly imported now, so it's the world price of gas. So what percentage, therefore, of that actual bill is within the control of the energy company is, number one, its operating costs, and number two, its profit. And you add that together, less than 20% of your bill is actually controlled by the company. 80% is outside its control. But it gets 80% of the blame for a rising bill of which they can only have 20% of the responsibility. And that, of course, is a real problem for us now as we move into a phase in which we are required to invest very significantly in new generation, new plant in this country as we move from our traditional way of producing energy, broadly speaking, based at least 40–50% on coal, into a new, greener and decarbonised world. That is more expensive. It's more expensive both in actually building the plant, and in some instances it's more expensive in running the plant as well, because you have to have backup. So we are going to be more expensive, not less, not of the desire of the industry, but because of government policy. So a bill will go up as a consequence. Who will get the blame? Ourselves. Why does government not confess up to its policy? Well, how many politicians do you know who are prepared to put up their hand and say, vote for me, I'm going to put your bill up? So they're not going to do that. So what you do is you turn it on the industry. Now, the industry, therefore, has got itself to step up to this plate in a number of ways. Firstly, it has got to explain. It has got to explain all the way across the piece about energy, about what you're paying for, that this isn't some magical thing that arrives at the switch without any apparent infrastructure to connect the source of the supply to yourselves. We have to explain. We haven't, and part of that is probably where the industry came from, as Jo showed in her slides earlier. So we have to be clear. We have to give careful explanations. We have to set out very steadily, very carefully, and in proper, honest and open terms, what it is that you pay for and what it is that we as an industry can also do. We have to think like the supermarkets. I'm a great fan of the Sainsbury's to You service because I can order it online. It turns up at least within half an hour of the time that I asked them to turn up and on the day that I wanted them. That, to me, is good service. You may not quite be able to do it as a utility, but think like that sort of retail service when you're operating a utility, and the service that comes out at the end will be an order of magnitude better as far as change is concerned. I actually think that complaints in some respects are a good thing rather than a bad thing. If you don't hear from people, you don't know what people think. If you do hear from people, you do. The trick is to act on it. And so listen to the complaints and act on it. And another thing that we need to do is we need to be simple in terms of our tariffs, and it needs to be easy for people to switch. We need to work with our customers, with our consumer groups, and with the government and the regulator. I forgot the regulator. Never underestimate the ability of the regulator to foul things up. Regulation was there to provide a framework. These days, it interferes in so many things, of which one is the interaction between a company, a regulated company, and its customer. So we think that as an industry, we're entering a difficult time. We are a utility, but in terms of what we're doing about it, it is picking up that trust agenda and taking it out. It is being honest and open and simple. It's providing people with the service they want. It is explaining, and it's going out to them. And I hope it works, because we certainly do need to have the customers with us as we do this great big £110 billion worth of investment over the next decade. Thank you.